Alright, so now we're going to take a look at methods. So, out of everything that I cover for this sort of introduction to structured programming, before we get into dealing with classes and objects with object-oriented programming, I want to say that methods will be probably the most important topic that we need to cover, considering the fact that whenever you're actually building out very large-scale programs, as we're going to see, methods are going to be essential to how you can kind of organize and keep track of everything in your programs. So to start off with, taking a look at an introduction to methods. As more content is added to an application, the source code becomes larger and more difficult to maintain. So this is talking about dealing with very large programs where there's a lot of different features that you have to work with. For example, the source code for Windows 10, so if you're dealing with, say, an operating system, this is going to have approximately 50 million lines of code inside of it. So there needs to be a way to keep track of the different parts of such a massive code base. And methods are going to be an effective way to take all of that source code and break that up into smaller, more manageable pieces. So that then you don't have to try and manage the entire program all at once. You only really have to focus on a single method or just a single piece of that program, and then just work on that until you've got that fully functioning, and then you can move on to the next piece. So the two greatest benefits to incorporating methods into your programs are going to be the inclusion of this divide and conquer problem solving, this ability to break that complex program into smaller, more manageable pieces, as well as the ability to simplify your programs with what is known as code reuse. Or you could refer to this as keeping your program dry, where dry is an acronym for do not repeat yourself. And there are actually a couple of other instances where we've seen this idea of code reuse. In particular, we've already looked at dealing with different types of loops, like the while loop, the do while loop, and the for loop. That is another example of code reuse in that you don't have to continuously repeat the lines that you're going to execute over and over again inside of your source code. Instead, you put that into a loop, and then that loop mechanism kind of handles that for you. So getting into methods, there are going to be two types of methods. There are void methods, and then there are value returning methods. So a void method is going to be a method that performs a task and then terminates. That's it. A value returning method is going to be one that performs a task and then returns a value that can be assigned to a variable or maybe used in some further processing, and then it would terminate. So the key distinction is that there's that one extra step with a value returning method where, as the name would imply, it's going to return a value. So there are a couple of different examples of each of these these two different kinds of methods. Primarily, these are going to be things that we've already seen from certain method calls we've had to make for methods that come from the Java API. So good examples of this include the print or printline statements that you get from system.out. So you have things like system.out.println, system.out.print, perhaps even system.out.printf. Each one of these is going to be a void method. All it's being used to do is just print some content to the output window, to that console window, but it doesn't actually return a value. So when you do a system.out.println, you can't take that method or that command and then try to say that you want to assign that to some variable. Alternatively, if you're working with something like, say, one of the methods from the math class, like this math.pow that we have right here, so that pow method will actually return a value. So you put in some numbers, say 4 and 2, that would just do 4 squared or give you 16, and then that 16 that you get from that, from performing that operation, you can go ahead and take that value and then assign that to a variable. So you can see that here with this value returning method, that we're going to go ahead and assign that result, that 16 that we get, into this variable square. And so the key distinction is that you can't do that sort of thing with a void method, so you wouldn't be able to do something like that with, say, this printline method here. So in order to start using methods in your programs, those methods must first be defined. So it's not terribly different from declaring a variable. If you want to actually use some kind of variable in your program, first you have to actually declare it. You give it a data type and a name, so that then when you actually use that name later in your program, the program actually recognizes what you're talking about. So the main method is going to be a good place to start looking over how to actually define, let's say we start with a void method. So we've got our public static void main, and then that string args that we see inside of the parentheses. That whole piece right there, as we've mentioned before, is the main method header. And then we have that pair of curly braces, and all of the code that we've put inside of that makes up the main method body. So the main method's header, this is going to be the primary thing that we need to look at when we are defining a method. That's going to consist of the following parts. So we're going to see in a moment we're dealing with these method modifiers, public and static. In addition to that, we're going to see 3 other parts. So there's going to be 4 parts in total that we want to consider for the header of any method. So the first one, public static, these are going to be the method modifiers. So these are additional keywords that modify the method in some particular way. For example, the public keyword is going to be what is known as an access specifier. For now, all methods that you write will use public and static for their method modifiers. To briefly describe these, public, when we talk about access specifiers, simply means that if we were going to include other classes, as we'll see a little bit later on, those other classes would be able to use that method because it is public. And then the static keyword, the best way to describe that is to say that anytime you make a method that is static, that method belongs to the class itself. And again, once we get into classes a little bit later, you'll see the distinction when we deal with methods that don't use that static keyword, that belong to objects of that class instead. And of course, then when we get into more advanced topics and we really dig deeper into the static keyword, then you'll get a much more developed explanation of what that means. So for now, just keep in mind that all of the methods you write are always going to have that public static at the beginning. Everything that comes after that is going to be the stuff that we really get to kind of explore and kind of experiment with. So the next thing that we have after the public static, we have that void keyword. So we have public static void in our main method. And that void is going to correspond to the return type. So this is going to indicate the data type of the variable or literal that the method returns. If the method doesn't actually return anything, then we're going to use the void keyword. So in the case of the main method, that method does not return anything, so we use the void keyword. After the return type is going to be the name of the method. So in this case, we're dealing with the main method. Similar to variables, methods require a name. This is going to be necessary when you want to actually use the method later. In this particular case, the method name is just main. And then after the method name, we've got that pair of parentheses, and inside of that is going to be where we place what are known as the parameters. So the last part is going to be those parameters. You've noticed for some methods you have to pass in values. You've got to put something into that pair of parentheses whenever you call that method. The parameters in a method header will determine the values that you can pass in. So if you're dealing with methods that don't take anything, you just leave that pair of parentheses empty. But if you're dealing with something that is expecting some kind of parameter, some value to be passed in, then you would go ahead and specify what it is that you're expecting in those parentheses. So taking all of this now, we'll go ahead and kind of combine this together to try to come up with our own definition of our own custom method. So we'll use the main method as a reference. Let's consider the following definition for another void method. So another method that doesn't return anything, and as you can see from the empty parentheses at the end, doesn't expect any parameters or doesn't take any values. So this one's going to be public static void display message. So we see the public static, the method modifiers. We see void, that return type indicating that in this case this method does not return anything. And then display message, that's going to be the name of the method. So before we get any further with this, let's go ahead and actually put this together. We'll go ahead and minimize that. Come over to NetBeans, and we'll go ahead and create a new project. So we'll make a new Java application. And for this one, this is primarily going to be to test out not only this introduction, but we'll use this for the next couple of major sections that we're going to go through, where we talk about both using parameters and returning values. So to kind of describe everything that we're going to be doing with this program, let's just go ahead and call this our method demo. Go ahead and click finish. And so then we'll go ahead and remove the extra comments that we're not going to need, and we'll go ahead and clean up the style a little bit and do something kind of like this for everything. We'll go ahead and leave the to-do stuff alone. We're not going to worry too much about the main method. Instead, what we're going to go ahead and do is create our own additional method. So that's going to be outside of the main method, but inside of our class body. So we'll go ahead and just put it right after the main method right here. So keep in mind that it's going to be between this closing curly brace and this closing curly brace. I'm going to go ahead and place it right here. So we got our public static and then void. So for this particular portion, it's exactly the same as if we were writing out the main method. The next thing that we're going to include, this is the part where things are going to be different, is the name of it. So we're going to say, in this case, it's called display message. And then we have that pair of empty parentheses, just indicating that this method is not expecting any parameters. We'll then go ahead and include a pair of curly braces to start the body of this method. And inside of here, all we're going to do is just have it print out a message to the console. So say system.out.println right here. And to double check the message we're going to go ahead and print, we're going to say hello from the display message method. So let's go ahead and include that right here. So say hello from the display message method. Go ahead and save that. And so now that we've got this, if we were to run this program right now, we would see that it doesn't do anything. So we've got a print statement right here, but we don't see it printing to the console, and we might be wondering, why is that? So if we double check right here, there's a little bit more to look through. So how exactly do we use this method in a program? Well, just like the methods from other classes in the Java API, say like this print method or that math.pow, that pow method that we saw, in order to use it, we've got to actually call that method somewhere. And so the one part of our program that we always look at, or that's always going to do something, is the main method. We're always going to execute that. It's just implicitly and automatically called whenever we tell the program to run. So what we need to go ahead and do is just put this call to display message inside of the main method. So we'll go ahead and minimize this, come back over here. And so now go ahead and get rid of this to-do stub, and we're going to replace this with a call to display message. And so in order to call it, all I do is just put in the name and then that pair of parentheses to indicate that this is a method call. So we'll say display message and that pair of parentheses. We'll go ahead and close that statement, save that. And so now, if I go ahead and run this again, it will now go ahead and say hello from the display message method. So before we move on, just to kind of wrap up on this introduction, we should take a moment to make sure that we actually understand the flow of a program now that we are including our own custom methods. So whenever you call a method, it is important to keep in mind that control will shift from the calling method to the called method. So in this example that we just went through, the main method is going to be the calling method because that's where we see the call to the other method. And then display message is going to be the called method. So that's the method whose name we've actually specified and who we're actually trying to call. So method calls are how one method communicates to another method that you need to actually use whatever code is inside of that method. So you can think of this kind of like if you need to call somebody to come perform some particular service for you or to provide some kind of product to you, maybe like an electrician, because you need the services that they provide. So if we take one more quick look at this program, so we're saying that the main method is the calling method because it has this method call inside of it, and then display message is the method that we are calling. It is the called method. And so that means that essentially the main method is saying, I need to access whatever is inside of display message, and I need to go ahead and use that code here. So that's what it's going to go ahead and do. And of course, if I needed to, I could do multiple calls, just to take a quick look at this as well. Go ahead and save that. And so now if I do this, basically what we're saying is that we need to use whatever code is inside of display message multiple times. So if we run this again, for every one of those method calls, it's going to go ahead and just come over and execute the code inside of display message. Okay. So at this point, this will wrap up the introduction. In the next video, we're going to go ahead and start taking a look at how to pass parameters, or what are known as arguments, into these methods. So we're going to see what it's like to actually start adding something into those parentheses in the next video.